Welcome to the Stumbling Spirit, contemplations on the path of resilience. Whether you realize it or not, you are resilient. It's your birthright. As you take in your next breath, know this truth. It's not only about your capacity to overcome difficult situations, but it's about your courage to do the necessary work to heal, learn, grow, and move forward. What you gain is invaluable wisdom. And it's through these hard stumbles in life that we often discover a new purpose that aligns with our spirit. My name is Fabio da Silva Fernandez, Reiki Master, Mindfulness Coach, and Mystical Explorer. Join me weekly as the Stumbling Spirit podcast highlights the lives of extraordinary people like you, sharing transformative stories and beneficial practices of resilience to guide you on your wellness journey. It was conceived to ensure equal opportunities and protections for everyone in the workplace, but the current U.S. administration calls diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, quote, illegal and immoral discrimination programs, unquote, and has ended DEI policies in all U.S. federal departments and agencies. Some corporations have followed suit, including Amazon, Ford, Walmart, and Meta, otherwise known as Facebook. However, according to Pew Research, the majority of U.S. employees see DEI as a good thing, citing fairness in hiring, pay, and promotions. And Harvard Business Review reports a correlation between DEI initiatives and the ability of companies to successfully adapt to change. North of the border, the Canadian Labour Congress is lobbying to preserve DEI programs within Canada. Here to talk about all of this and more is Jade Pichette. Jade is a trans advocate, DEI professional, and director of programs at Pride at Work Canada, an organization whose focus is on helping employers create safer, more inclusive work environments for 2S LGBTQIA+ people. It's a pleasure to welcome Jade Pichette to the show. Hi, Jade.
Hi, Fabio. It's such a pleasure to be with you.
I'm so honored. Thank you. Before I continue, I just want to clarify your title, which I think is amazing. So you are a professional in inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, or IDEA for short. It's the first time I'd ever heard that. Did you come up with that?
No, I didn't come up with that myself. There are other people who use IDEA, so I'm not sure who first used it, but it's been around.
I think it's great. But for the purpose of this discussion and just for consistency, I will use DEI, but bearing in mind that accessibility is a part of that. So maybe just to anchor us in the conversation, can you explain what is DEI?
So, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a series of practices and essentially a framework for how you engage with people, especially in the workplace. So, there are DEI programs in other types of institutions, but usually what we're talking about is a workplace context. And so, going to the words themselves, diversity being who's in the room. So, looking at who we have in our space in terms of their backgrounds, in terms of their experiences, in terms of their identities. You know, diversity is a fact of human life and is something that is more looked at. And so in the Canadian context, we often look at equity deserving groups that are laid out by the Employment Equity Act, being women, visible minorities, Indigenous peoples, and people with disabilities. And there was a push to try and also create a category for Black folks specifically, and for 2S LGBTQI plus folks. So two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer, intersex, and asexual people. And so really we're looking at those pieces, but we're looking at other pieces as well, including education, where people went to school, what their educational profession is as well. All of these pieces go into diversity. And then we look at inclusion. Inclusion says, how do people get in the room? And so inclusion really looks at what are we creating in terms of a space for everybody? Is everybody welcome at the table? Is everybody able to reach the table and welcome at that table? And so inclusion is really about how we bring people in and how they feel welcome in a space. Equity, however, is much more specifically regarding the inequalities that we see within society. So, I'm a queer and trans educator, and so I often use those examples. And so, for example, in Canada, it has been found by using StatsCan data, Statistics Canada data, that gay men make less than heterosexual men in Canada, lesbian women make less than that, bisexual men and straight women make less than lesbians, and then bisexual women make the least. And then we've also seen significant pay disparities for trans people, including being 5 times more likely to be below the low income cutoff in Canada than the general population. And so there are very clear inequities there in terms of access to equitable work. And so equity really says, how do we make sure that these inequalities are dealt with? How do we make sure that we create that space that everybody has an equal opportunity to advance in their organization, to make as much as somebody else at their level makes, and really create that space so that those injustices that we see broader in society don't translate to the workplace. And so those practices can be varied for different DEI programs. They can really look in many different ways. They can be doing employee engagement surveys where you look at the data for specific equity deserving groups and what has been their experience at that organization. It could be training programs that look at how do we have better cultural competency with different groups. It could be specific leadership or mentorship programs for equity deserving groups. So all of these things are created as a way to recognize that as a people, we are diverse and we come from diverse backgrounds, identities, and experiences, that for the best solutions, people need to feel included and have space at the table and really be able to be psychologically safe in expressing their opinions, their knowledge, their experience at that table, and that there aren't additional inequities that are being experienced by people. So DEI looks many, many different ways at every different organization, but there are some common practices like training, education, looking at experience and professional development programs. And so I think you started out with the US context, and I think we can probably get into that in a bit more depth. But within the US context, there's also the issue of affirmative action. And affirmative action is a separate but connected activity that we don't have in Canada. We don't have affirmative action in the same way in Canada. And so often what is seen as just affirmative action being the same as DEI, or that's the perception that a lot of people have, when in fact DEI is a whole host of different practices that are really there to make sure that everybody is included, everybody has a fair shot. And because historically people haven't had a fair shot. And so we really want to create that and make that. And we know that organizations that have active DEI programs, that have diversity, who have inclusive cultures, who take equity seriously, that they perform better in the marketplace. But we also know it's just the right thing to do. And I think there's many ways that you can approach DEI practices without even using the words DEI, but that can be a further conversation.
So you mentioned earlier employment engagement surveys. You mentioned training. You mentioned leadership opportunities as examples of initiatives that organizations could undertake to become more inclusive. I know that those were high level examples, but I'm just wondering if you could maybe share a specific example of something that a company could initiate to inspire more of an inclusive environment for everyone in the workplace.
I think one of the major initiatives is employee resource groups. Employee resource groups, which have many different names, so affinity groups, business resource groups, and others, are really a space for employees to come together around a shared identity or a commitment to making the workplace a better space for that shared identity. And so, for example, with Pride or 2S LGBTQI plus employee resource groups or ERGs, they really create a impact on the organization as a whole in many different ways. So one, it gives people who are members of the community or supporters of the community space to come together, to interact, to connect, to build a sense of community within their company and not feel so alone as well. Because when you're the only person from an equity deserving group, it can get very, very lonely. And that reduces retention. So ERGs help increase retention and really create more of this space for equity deserving groups to feel connected, to feel welcome, to feel a part of. But they also provide other aspects. So sometimes employee resource groups will be involved in creating training for their organizations. Sometimes they will be consulted when it comes to policies being inclusive. So, for example, I've worked with employee resource groups who are being consulted on their parental leave policies or their bereavement leave policies or their workplace harassment policy, those types of things, and trying to make them as inclusive and as representative of the community as possible. And so the employee resource groups, they also will create events for the community that they're serving. But usually those events are either educational or celebratory in nature, and usually welcome people who aren't part of that community as well. And so they really create more of a sense of community connection and allyship within the organization that without the ERG would be much, much harder to engage with.
I used to be a part of an ERG for a previous organization that I was a part of, and it was great. It was really good to connect with fellow colleagues that I could identify with and learn about what the company was doing to advocate for or represent the 2S LGBTQIA plus community and what I could do to participate in that. So I think it's definitely something that is really worth getting behind for sure, 100%. So you mentioned employee resource groups as one of the things that organizations can do. And so I'm just wondering, in a general sense, how does the company benefit and how do employees benefit from DEI programs?
So the company can benefit on a number of aspects. One is retention. DEI programs consistently increase retention for equity deserving groups and people who care about equity deserving groups. So that's the majority of the company right there. And so retention is a huge, huge aspect, but so is recruitment. People are more likely to work at an organization that they see as welcoming, as respecting human rights in the workplace, as caring about inclusion. So people are more likely to seek your company out as an option. The other piece is diversity of thought. We know that when people come from different experiences, different perspectives, that they create better solutions. And there was one study that's a few years old now, came out in 2020, that actually showcased that Canadian companies that were 2S LGBTQI plus inclusive, which was a very broad category, to be fair, but their definition of it showcased that companies were 22% more likely to fare well in the market than their competitors. And I think recognizing that is all due to diversity of thought. If people feel like they're psychologically safe enough to share their opinions, to share their knowledge, to share their experience, they're going to come up with better solutions and have a better impact. So those are kind of the main things that I see on the company side is essentially your retention, your attraction, which goes to your brand as well. So, if you have a positive view in the community, you're going to have both attraction as well as consumer benefits as well. And then there's the aspect of diversity of thought of creating these better solutions. On the employee end, it creates more of a sense of belonging. And that belonging is something that, going back to what I was saying earlier, keeps people there. People don't leave employers because they just are tired and want something else very often. Usually they're leaving it because their direct manager is terrible. They've not been given a sense of any advancement or opportunity to advance. And those generally, and then a toxic work culture overall. Those are the three things that people leave most positions for. And so that if you're creating this culture where people feel like they're part of something, where they are welcomed, where they're not just tolerated but celebrated for being who they are going to stay in those jobs. They're going to stay in those workplaces and really contribute to a higher degree. We know that people who are out at work and feel safe to be out at work are better performers than those who aren't from research. So all of these things have a major impact on people staying where they are and feeling more invested in the work that they do. And we really see this across the board. Now, if the company isn't fulfilling the commitments and obligations that they brought forward, then you get into some issues of potential tokenism and other challenges that people will see through as not being authentic. So those practices really do have to be also authentic and feel authentic for them to have that lasting impact for employees. Because employees are really good at smelling when something is off. This is something I've learned quite well.
I was also reading that women have largely benefited from DEI programs since they were initiated by a lot of organizations. And I was also looking into the history, and I didn't realize that it dated back to at least the mid 60s with the civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, over the years, increased with awareness, with it picking up steam in the 2000s. So, from your perspective, and in a general sense, what has been, you highlighted some of them in terms of retention, in terms of having a diversity of thought, but I'm just wondering if there are maybe key achievements that you can highlight with respect to DEI in corporate culture in general.
That's a big one. I would say that we have seen a broad shift in corporate Canada. I work in Canada, so my experience is really here. But I've seen a definite shift with employers and how they treat their equity deserving staff. And I've seen that through things like mentorship programs. I've seen that through engagements with community events and observances. The fact that we honor things like Black History Month in the workplace, the fact that we honor Pride in the workplace, that we, celebrate all these different moments through the year is not something that companies always did. And so that I think has been a real success in showcasing the diversity of their organizations. And I think it's something that companies have also needed to do to keep up with the changing labor force. Like I live in Takaranto or Toronto, which is Treaty 13 territory, as well as covered by the Williams Treaties signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. And this city, one of the most diverse cities on earth, was primarily run by just white men not that long ago. And organizations have had to really recognize that the workforce has changed. And as the workforce has changed, they also have to recognize that the issues of our communities come with us. They come with us through the door for both positive and negative reasons. They come with us. And that change in demographics, I think, has spurred some of these additional pieces, as well as the progression of human rights. I know a lot of the original DEI programs came about because of human rights cases where essentially the employer was discriminating against a specific group, whether that was women, Black folks, Indigenous folks, queer folks, and had to essentially have legal ramifications. Our protections here on a legal basis are pretty strong in Canada for workers. They could still be stronger, but the recognition of human rights is something that is very important. And so I think that I've seen this shift as we've seen this shift in demographics, as we've seen additional human rights be put in place, that companies have been catching up to follow suit with that as well. When I started doing this work, we didn't have legal protections for trans people in Canada. That just didn't exist when I started doing this work 20 years ago. And so it's really, I think, a testament to how far we've come in that these organizations are actually recognizing their history of discrimination. They're saying, I don't want to discriminate, whether it's for just the legal reasons and the financial impact of that, or if it's the moral case, regardless, it's still having the same impact for workers, which is a more welcoming Canada. I still think we have a long way to go, and discrimination cases are still happening across the country consistently. But I have seen that shift in just doing the bare minimum to actually recognizing and honoring these moments of celebration, of honoring the diversity in our communities, honoring the diversity of workers. I've really seen that shift, especially over the last decade.
So, in my introduction, I mentioned what's going on in the US. You're in Canada,
Yeah.
I'm in Canada. However, usually what happens in the US tends to seep
Yeah.
across the border. And so that is the reason why I brought it up. And so I just wanted to get your perspective. What do you think is precipitating the backlash against DEI programs?
To call a spade, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism. I think DEI programs have their failings, and I'm happy to talk about that as well. But I think where we're seeing the backlash is not based on fact and more based on hatred. And I think that is very dangerous. I think it is a very dangerous road that of what is happening currently in the US. As an autistic person, I'm very concerned about, for instance, the fact that they're creating an autistic registry without people's consent. I'm concerned about the fact that they've rolled back trans rights to nearly the Stone Age in a very short amount of time and are trying to do even more damage. I am concerned about the fact that they're potentially going after same sex marriage in the US. All of these things I think are really, really dangerous and really concerning and are based on hatred because it is easier to. This is a little bit of a slight political hat, but it's easier to control a population when you give them somebody to hate. And it is much harder to address the fact that we have an affordability crisis across our two countries, that we have unbelievable increased wealth inequality to the degree that we haven't seen since before the French Revolution. It's something that I think is beyond even our comprehension how far that is in terms of the inequality from billionaires versus everybody else. And so I really think that it is a political tactic to fight down on the communities who have historically pushed for more equity and have historically pushed for a more just and welcoming society. And who are those folks? They're Indigenous folks, they're Black folks, they're queer folks, they're women. So I think it is a very dangerous road that we're seeing. And I think it has some very dangerous implications, but I think it is coming directly out of hatred. That being said, as I said, I do believe DEI has some errors to it because as an industry, it's not regulated. And so, how DEI practices are put in place across the board is there is no consistency. And so sometimes DEI programs are super effective, super welcoming, super impactful. And then other times they're actually having a bit of blowback. And I think that blowback is also part of the issue that we're seeing. So, what I mean by blowback is that if people are forced into trainings about this identity, that identity, another identity, if that person doesn't know how to do that in a good way, that can also cause harm to the communities that have historically been harmed because people will feel like this is being forced on them. They'll feel like this is taking them away from their actual work. They can feel like that they are being shamed for being part of the privileged group. All of these things I've seen happen with some DEI training that wasn't done in a good way. So I do think that has an impact on the backlash against DEI, but I don't think it is the main cause of the backlash. So I think we can very justifiably critique DEI programs. I think we can very justifiably look at what is the efficacy. And there's a really great book by Lily Zhang, who's an educator out of the US, called DEI Deconstructed. And she's since come out with another one called DEI Reconstructed, and previously has a book called The Ethical Sellout. And she really details the evidence case for DEI and also where DEI has failed very, very well. And so I do think there is legitimate reasons to critique DEI. Even as an organization, Pride at Work Canada, we're moving away from the DEI language and towards human rights at work language. But I do think that they're worthwhile programs, and most of what is happening is based in hatred and based in trying to get people to focus on marginalized groups instead of focusing on things like the economy.
It's definitely a red herring, and it's a definite distraction. And it's also the lowest common denominator that the US administration is targeting, which are, as you said, people of color, people with disabilities, the 2S LGBTQ plus community, and many other marginalized groups. And we're seeing it with the mass deportations of
Mm-hmm.
immigrants. And that's really scary, to
It
see that a
is.
democracy, or what was touted as the best democracy in the world, is doing something so abhorrent and just unimaginable to all of these people. And I also get what you mean about, the ability to fine tune and improve DEI programs or some DEI programs, but at the same time, that's not, as you say, the root cause behind all of this. So hopefully, we're able to weather the storm. And I want to get into that a little bit later in terms of how do we move forward from a DEI perspective, but I'm going to park that part of the conversation for the time being. We talked a little bit about it in terms of what is behind what's going on in the US, and hopefully it doesn't, permeate within Canada. But I'm wondering whether you think the actions of what's taken place in the US has anything to do with anti-trans sentiment.
I mean, anti-trans sentiment is something that is has a long history. I mean, many people don't know this, but the first book burning by the Nazis, which a lot of images are of the first book burning, was actually the Hirschfeld Institute, which was an institute of sexology that actually also provided gender affirming care for trans people. And so the Nazis, one of the first people they went after was trans people and queer people, in addition to disabled people. And so I think that is often forgotten as part of our history. And we're seeing that happen again. And we're seeing that happen globally because historically, if we look across history, there is so many examples of gender diverse people who were part of community, who were part of major roles. Like among the Greeks, there were the Galli, who were people who were assigned male at birth, who were castrated and then lived as priestesses, took a woman's name, all of these things. We saw among the ancient Norse peoples, we saw examples of the priest of Frey. Priestesses of Frey were assigned male at birth, but had these cultural roles. And then we look at indigenous peoples across the world, where there are many, many cultural roles. Among Two Spirit people in Turtle Island or North America, we see upwards of 13 different cultural roles, not just two. In certain nations, most had about three or four, sometimes five, but there were some that went up to 13, And so I think our history as trans and gender diverse people is long, it's deep, but so is the history of hatred against us. And that really comes out of colonization and colonization violence. And the places that we see anti trans legislation, we see anti trans laws, all were colonized by white Western powers, every single one. And there are a few exceptions in the world, like, for example, Thailand, which is one of the most accepting communities for trans people. It is so much safer to be trans in Thailand than many other parts of the world, partially because they were never colonized. And so those cultural roles were left there, were, still there. And so this anti-trans hate, I think, is a real intentional tool, more so to control women than anybody, because they don't want women feeling like they can have control over their own bodies. They don't want women to have control over their own bodily autonomy. And one of the first places that you can attack bodily autonomy is by trans rights. And these things are deeply, deeply connected. And yet we have people like J.K. Rowling who are notoriously bigoted towards the trans community. It's very important that we recognize that this is a global action. This is an intentional action. And we're seeing this hatred happen across the world. It's honestly very scary as a trans person these days. I'm very lucky being somebody who lives in Canada, who lives in Toronto. As a trans person, I am very blessed, quite honestly. And I don't take that for granted by any means. I work full time. I have a full time job where I get to be a trans person. That's pretty rare and pretty special. And most trans people don't have those same opportunities. So I try to keep that in stride. And it's really concerning what we're seeing happening on a global level. Just this week, we had the UK Supreme Court rule that trans women are not women and are not allowed to use gender segregated facilities anymore. And will, from now on, male officers will be the ones patting down trans women in strip searches, which that is going to impact women. That's going to impact cis women. And it blows my mind that people don't realize this, because all an officer has to do is say they suspect that you're a trans woman, therefore you're getting strip searched by a man. And this anti-trans rhetoric hasn't gotten to the same level in Canada, partially because our human rights are a bit more enshrined here than some other places. But that doesn't mean that that can't happen. And we are seeing now there's 2 jurisdictions in Canada where anti-trans legislation has been put in place, being Alberta and Saskatchewan. There was an anti-trans bill in New Brunswick, but that has since been overturned. And these are really, really concerning and really scary to be a trans person in 2025. I really thought we were getting to a place where we were going to have increased safety, security, ability to live our lives. And the backslide has been so fast and so global because there are people like J.K. Rowling, Elon Musk, who are billionaires who hate the trans community and don't want you thinking about the fact that they're billionaires. And so they punch down on this one group of 1% instead of making sure that the community recognizes the other 1% that is the actual issue. I'm getting a little political here and a little heated, so I hope that's okay. But it's honestly, it's a scary time to be a trans person.
It's interesting. I was having a chat with a friend the other day, and what I've noticed is that in the various chat shows that are out there, usually the people that are saying things against the trans community are men, and the primary group that they're targeting are trans women. And
Yes.
I'm not saying that trans men aren't being targeted or that it's easier for trans men, but I've just noticed that in the general discourse of what's going on out there, it's trans women that are being targeted in these discussions. Just a quick sidebar, I recognize that there are countless men who are allies to women and the trans community. This is just a casual observation about certain men in positions of power and influence who are sexist and transphobic. And I was saying to my friend, I said, it's not enough for men to control women's bodies, they also have to control trans women's bodies.
Yeah, I mean I would reframe that, because that makes it sound like trans women aren't women. But I would phrase that as, in order to control cis women's bodies, they start by controlling trans women's bodies. That's how I would frame that. Because we have already seen in the States trans women get arrested for just using the bathroom. We've seen that happen in Florida. But we've also seen cis women, and far more cis women, being harassed by police, by security, by using the women's washroom because it's assumed that there are trans women. And anybody that's gender nonconforming in any way, including all those grannies with that short hair, all of these people are at risk. And it really concerns me. And I would say that there is actually a large contingent of women that hate trans people, but they're pretty much all white women and from Anglophone countries. There's a few exceptions to that, but for the most part, that is what we see. And I'm not super shocked about that, because even if we looked at the results of the 2024 US election, white women voted primarily for Trump in terms of demographics. More white women voted for Trump than against Trump. And I think that really goes to show that there is a deep contingent of these cis women, although they would be offended by me calling them cis, even though that's not a slur in any regard. It's just an adjective. But I've seen this and I've experienced it as well. I was the target of a hate campaign back in 2012 by a group of trans-exclusionary radical feminists. So it was cis women who hate trans people, who were sending me death threats, who were calling me terrible, terrible things, putting me on hate lists. It was a terrible time in my life. And I've seen this happen to many other trans women by cis women. So the politicians who are making the biggest noise about these issues are mostly men, but it's not exclusively. I mean, we look at, for instance, Nancy Mace in the US, who is a member of Congress and openly uses the T slur in Congress and has not been censured by the Speaker of the House, even though she is using an active slur in Congress. And we've seen her fake being harassed by people before, and plenty of that's been caught on video. But it is concerning that there are these white cis women who will back up transphobic men and really cause harm as well. But that being said, I think the primary concern is transphobic men, because they don't experience sexism and they often are looking at how can they also control women's bodies of all types.
I just want to explain to our listeners who might not know what cis is. And so I just want,
Apologies.
no, that's okay. I just want to explain, and if I say anything wrong, please correct me. But cis is really just about identifying with the gender at birth. So I'm a cisgender male. I'm a cisgender gay man. I was born male and I identify with my sex at birth. And so anybody that identifies with their sex at birth is considered cis. Did I do a good job at that?
Yeah, I would just frame it as assigned at birth, but that's the only change that I would make. So, somebody who is cis identifies with the gender they were assigned at birth. And the reason why I say assigned is because there are intersex people in the world, and intersex people are neither male nor female, but are generally still assigned a gender at birth as male or female, even though chromosomally, hormonally, in terms of secondary sex characteristics, gonads, genitalia, etc., might be different than primarily just male or female. So that's the only change that I would make. But you're good. You're good.
Well, thank you. Thank you for explaining that as well. I really do appreciate that. I'm sorry about the hate that you received. That must be very scary. And it does actually line up with the stats, the unfortunate stats that I was seeing online about the alarming rise in hate crimes against the 2S LGBTQIA plus. It's actually risen quite a bit. In 2003, hate crimes motivated by sexual orientation rose by 69%, according to Statistics Canada. And from 2016 to 2023, this number increased by 388%. I was really alarmed by that. I'm just wondering, how do we turn this around?
It is a very good question. And I would say that we can't stop as a community, but we also have to listen a bit more. I think as a community, we have gotten to a place where at times we are judging the other that doesn't understand us. And I really feel like we need to create more space for connection with people who are different than us, who may not understand us. And it is when we have those spaces of connection where we lead with shared values. We all believe in human rights, or we all care about each other in our community. We all care about having a welcoming community. Really getting to the core of those pieces of connection with one another. I think that is something that is needed, and it's needed across the board. And sometimes it's really hard to do. because it's really hard to sit down against somebody who doesn't believe in your life, your identity, your experiences. But it is important to do so, and I really do think that we are able to change people's hearts and minds if we do that, if we create that space for connection, for community, for welcoming each other. And that means being out in community. That means being not just hiding in your house, which, like, it's hard sometimes. It's hard to leave the house sometimes. I'm somebody with anxiety issues. Like, I've felt that way sometimes where it's like, I just can't do it today. But we have to build that community. We have to talk to our neighbors. We have to talk to our families. We have to talk to the people who we have some type of connection to because we're in community together, but we may not agree with one another. We may not understand one another. But I don't need you to understand me to respect me or to honor me or to care about me. You can completely not understand being trans. I actually don't care if you understand what being trans is like, because the only people who are truly going to understand are fellow trans people. But I care about you recognizing my humanity at the end of the day. And if we create space in vulnerability with one another, that is powerful. That is truly powerful. So I never intended to get into this line of work. My background's social work. I really thought I was going to be doing kind of frontline provision, counseling, those types of things. And one of the reasons why I still do this work is because workplaces are one of those places where we interact with one another across difference. And that is one of the most powerful places to create connection, to create understanding, to create care with one another. It's not to say that every workplace cultivates that. We definitely have seen ones that don't. But that being said, most people don't know a trans person in their personal life. And, sometimes when I do trans inclusion trainings, I actually will start off with getting people to do an anonymous survey of, is there a trans person in my family? Is there a trans person in my neighborhood? Is there a trans person in my friend circle? Like those types of things. And the numbers have gone up over the years as I've been doing this work, but still, most people don't know a trans person. And so when you're actually in connection with somebody, in active communication with them, that creates understanding, that creates welcome, like a welcome sense of this person is human beyond anything else. And so I think that workplaces are one of those powerful places where you can find that connection across differences. I also think religious spaces can be that too. I know that with the religious spaces that I have been in myself, I have definitely changed a lot of people's hearts and minds because they got to know me and they hadn't known anybody who was trans before me. And suddenly these became people who were advocates for the community, who would advocate in their own work. I had a friend who, I won't give too many details so as not to expose him, but he was pretty homophobic and transphobic when we first met. And it was our friendship that changed that around for him. And then he ended up, and he's a white, cis, straight man. And he actually brought forward a human rights complaint at his workplace because he saw how his coworkers were being treated and they didn't feel safe to speak up. And he credited me for his experience with me for why he did that, which is such a deep honor, for somebody to say that. So I think those connections are the piece that change people's experiences because we're just people. We're just trying to live our lives. We're just trying to be as happy as anybody else. We're just trying to survive just like anybody else, and I think when people actually meet us there, in compassion, in connection, that changes their opinion.
I'm glad you mentioned connection. Let's explore this connection piece from a DEI perspective. So, I mentioned in my introduction that there are some companies that have done away with their DEI programs. So, what does it say about those organizations who have done something like this? And then, more specifically, how can their employees feel safe in this climate?
Good question. I would say that, the companies who've done away with this work were not likely truly committed to doing this work to begin with. And so in many cases, it is just that type of scenario where what they were doing was performative. So it was more for appearance than it was for substance. And the companies where it's for substance, most cases, they have not eradicated their DEI programs. They've continued their DEI programs. There's been evidence of that in the US, 80% of companies have been maintaining or increasing their DEI programs. And I really see it as either organizations who are looking to the US federal government and just looking to their bottom line at the end of the day. Because having a diverse and inclusive workforce is better for your bottom line. However, when you are dealing with a government administration that is actively not going to give you a contract, not going to give you work because you have DEI programs, which is what is happening in the States, that's when some of these companies are leaving DEI, is specifically due to that reason, because they want government contracts, they want work with the government, and this is the US government's position at the time. It's not always been the US position. And previous to Trump being elected, very few companies had gotten rid of their DEI programs. It is primarily due to that election that we've seen companies do away with them. And in many cases, even companies who US divisions have gotten rid of their DEI programs, their Canadian divisions have kept them. And so we've seen that pretty consistently. Now, speaking to the employees, that's a whole different aspect because a lot of these employees don't feel safe now. They just don't. And you're going to see retention rates in those organizations go down pretty dramatically within the first year of them cutting their DEI programs. I can assure you, you are going to see that drop significantly. And that's something that they're going to have to weigh as a company as to what their next steps are. But I really think that it is based in this just government aspect as to why these programs are being eliminated, or primarily. But I do not see people feeling safe at their organizations, and we see people being cut all the time because it's assumed that their position is somehow connected to DEI. We've seen employee groups be cut because that's seen as DEI. We've seen programs that had longer histories than DEI, like Black History Month, that wasn't created due to DEI. It was just that DEI programs often adopted Black History Month because it already existed, right? And so I really worry for those employees, their safety, their sense of belonging. And these companies are going to see that happen and impact their bottom line, at least in the first couple of years.
To my listeners around the world, what do you think of my conversation with Jade Pichette? Have you noticed a departure from progressive policies in your country? What is your organization's approach to DEI? I'd love to hear from you. Just DM me on Instagram at The Stumbling Spirit. Jade, can you talk about what you do at Pride at Work Canada?
Sure. So I'm the director of programs here, and I've been with the organization for over 6.5 years. I oversee our programs team, which puts on all of our content, our research, and our consultations. So what I do is stay very busy. But I have a really, really amazing team though, who without which I don't know what I would do, even though when I started here, I didn't have a team. It was just me on programs. But since getting a team, I don't know what I would do without them. So everything that is our events, so our networking events, our educational programming, our leadership programs, all of these things come under my purview. And I'm responsible for overseeing all of them, though I have great team members who are looking after specific programs. And so within that work, I have to stay an expert on these issues and make sure to guide my team so that we're putting out content that is appropriate for our 250 different large employer members and over 100 community partner members across the country. And so right now, some of the main things that I'm focused on, for example, is our Spark conference in Toronto, our Winnipeg Pro Pride, and looking at our summer programming as well, because we're looking at doing events around the country. But I'm also working on consulting projects with a number of different organizations, planning a ton of trainings right now. Training isn't something that we think is the be all and end all of DEI programs or of inclusion more generally, but it is an aspect of it, and it is something that brings us in some money. So that's another thing that we've been doing a lot of. I recently got to train a fire department, for instance, which was very neat for the first time. I've gotten to go into all kinds of different spaces, from banks to law firms to skilled trades organizations to universities, tech organizations, and more. It's really been quite a privilege to do this work. And then we also are working on a new Know Your Rights guide for 2S LGBTQI plus employees. So the version 1 is already out, but the version 2 is coming hopefully later this fall. We also have an energy project that we're currently working on that is focused on making the electricity sector more inclusive in Canada, which is very exciting for the queer and trans community, and many, many other pieces as well. We kind of have our hands in a few different things, but all of which are focused on making workplaces more equitable and honoring the human rights of Two-Spirit, queer, and trans people.
It sounds really wide reaching and impactful. Do you have any sense of the positive influence that Pride at Work Canada has had on these organizations in Canada?
For sure. So when we started over 15 years ago now, in 2008, we were in a very different market. Most organizations didn't celebrate Pride. Even the major banks usually didn't celebrate Pride, with a couple exceptions. The law firms didn't. We didn't see movement at all towards inclusion in industries like the skilled trades that we now see that movement. And I've gotten to work with organizations on their policies. So I've seen more gender inclusive policies. I think I mentioned parental leave, bereavement leave before, workplace harassment policies, trans inclusion policies. Many employers now have trans inclusion policies, which is very recent. Most of them are within the last 5 years. We've seen gender inclusive benefits, queer inclusive benefits that take care of things like pre-exposure prophylactics, that is a protector against HIV, things like hormone replacement therapy for all people that need HRT, cis and trans alike. We've really seen a shift in terms of the amount of training that people receive and how people engage in their recruitment efforts and how they recruit folks from the community intentionally. And so we've really seen quite a few shifts in corporate Canada and through the work that we've explicitly done. We started as an organization that was primarily just networking events. That was what we were founded on. But we moved into that educational space and that consulting space. And it's sometimes harder to see the impact of just a networking event. than it is to see like an actual policy change or something along those lines. So I know those networking events have a place. They are impactful in a certain way, but we also know those more educational spaces have that bigger impact. For instance, our Spark event at the end of April really looked at what the experience is of our community on a global scale right now. We've brought in folks from Mexico, from the US, from Europe to actually talk about these issues and discuss them in depth. So we've also seen the ability for us to go deep on certain aspects of 2S LGBTQI plus inclusion that I don't see other organizations doing. And so we get to not only create a space for queer and trans people within those organizations through things like our networking events, but we also are able to directly influence policy, procedures, benefits, employee practices, and more through our consulting and educational programs.
That sounds amazing. You said that you work with 250 organizations, is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
So, what would you say is the general landscape within Canada from a DEI perspective, apart from those organizations that you're directly working with?
So I would say that large employers have a better sense of this work, but most Canadians work at small and medium sized employers, right? And so small and medium sized employers sometimes have a harder time implementing DEI efforts because if you're, just a mom and pop shop, it's much harder to keep up with all of these things if you don't have a dedicated person to work on them. And so I think that there is not necessarily the same level in smaller employers. But in any of the larger employers, there really is a sense that DEI is important. And most organizations have some type of DEI programming, even if they don't work with us directly. And so, the organizations we work with are generally the ones who are more inclusive towards the 2S LGBTQI plus community. However, there are some others that we don't work with currently that also have good policies, procedures, do the good work, even though we are not working with them directly in that membership format. And I've seen a lot of other organizations who work with other DEI organizations like the Canadian Center for Diversity and Inclusion, Catalyst, Ascend, which is for Asian, has an Asian focus, Black Talent Initiative, which is a really great organization, Indigenous Works, which is another really great organization. So different organizations will address and prioritize different communities. So extraction organizations who are working near or in Indigenous territories really often are more likely to have Indigenous inclusion programs, for example. Organizations who are based in big cities are more likely to have queer and trans inclusion programs, but there's obviously diversity within the industry or within the industries in many different ways. So I would say that, the state of DEI in Canada is not perfect. It's not infallible. And we have seen some organizations, especially those based in Alberta, who have been moving away from DEI, but some of them are just renaming it to something else. So University of Alberta calls it now access, community, and belonging, which some people have had concerns about, but also depending on how they implement it could be very similar. Right. So, some people are there. There are kind of a few paths that we see going on right now. So most organizations in Canada are just keeping their DEI efforts. Some are just reducing budgets somewhat, especially since 2020, because we had a whole swath of recognition of anti-Black racism, of issues related to the COVID pandemic that resulted in higher DEI programs and budgets. Some of those have come down now. And then there is this smaller group that is looking at renaming DEI to something else, and then an even smaller group that is abandoning it completely. So I think In Canada, we're not seeing exactly the same trends as we are in the US, but that could change depending on the government, the federal government, and provincial governments as well.
So you talk about the potential for change, and that's something that we want to avert. We want to continue the momentum of DEI. So how do we do that?
Good question. I mean, at Pride at Work, we're using the language of human rights at work. That's how we're pivoting. So we're moving away from using DEI ourselves. It's taking a moment for me to get the language and change some of that language because I've just been immersed in DEI for so long. But I think we keep the momentum by staying responsive. If we need to change the name or use different terminology, because that's going to be supported, we need to change the name or use different terminology. If we want to see that work in our organizations, we have to advocate for it as well. So we have to advocate that those dollars continue, that funding continues. And I think that is something that can happen. And that's one of the reasons why in the US they're cutting employee resource groups as one of the first things they're cutting, is because they know that people can organize and they know that they can use those groups to organize and create change within their organization to keep DEI programs or to keep certain aspects of those programs or continue other programs. And so, whether it's the ERG route, whether it's the union route, whether it's some other format, I think people just need to be in community with one another and advocate collectively on these issues and say, this is important to us and we need to keep this moving. The final piece that I will add is that people need to look at what position they're in, because DEI is not something that just comes from somebody who has DEI in their title. It's about how we all live it on a day-to-day basis. So how are we living it in our work? How are we living it in our personal lives? And how are we honoring the other? And I think we can do that in many different ways. If I was working in communications, I could make sure that the communications we send out have inclusive language. I could make sure that they have diverse casting. I could make sure that we recognize the different communities that we're trying to engage with. I would do those types of things. If I was working in finance, I may have less opportunity to do that, but maybe I'm working in a way that I can influence the supplier diversity policy and make sure that our supplier program is including people from equity deserving businesses. So in Canada, we have the Rainbow Registered program through the CGLCC, the Canadian 2S LGBTQI plus, there's no A, Chamber of Commerce. So, they have the Rainbow Registered program for organizations that are 50 to 51% owned by members of the community. We see other organizations that are visible minority owned or Indigenous owned or owned by disabled people, making sure that our supplier diversity policy is recognizing and that we have a supplier diversity program to begin with. Again, if I was working in finance, maybe it's looking at, can we bring some money towards queer nonprofit, or maybe they need a treasurer and I have that skill set and I can volunteer my time, So I really think that DEI is something that we all have to live for us to really truly get to a culture of belonging. It can't just rest with one person who has DEI in their title.
I recognize that I might not have asked all of the questions in relation to DEI, and so I just wanted to open it up to you and see if there's anything else that you wanted to add in addition to what we've discussed about today in relation to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Well, what I think I would close with is diversity is a fact of life. Inclusion is something that we all truly want. We all want to be included. We all want to feel like we belong. Nobody goes into the world saying, I want to be totally excluded from everything. Nobody says that, right? Really, it is something we all strive for. It's all something we all look for. And equity at the end of the day is just about making right the wrongs that we have seen. I don't think DEI is the only way to approach righting the wrongs of history. I think it's just one of the feathers in our cap, per se, towards doing so. And so I think there are other avenues and frameworks that have an impact. So in social work, we talk about anti-oppressive practice, which is not DEI. It is a different framework, but it is still trying to address the same roots of the issue. It is still trying to address the roots of harm in our communities. And then we have the aspect of human rights. And I think more and more we're going to have to talk about human rights at work. And we're going to have to frame things not through the lens of DEI, because the perception of DEI is becoming more and more toxic, even though it's divorced from the actual reality of what DEI is, but the perception of it is becoming that. And so, for us to move forward, we have to not be too stuck on these words and instead say, what moves the needle forward? And can we use a different word for it? Can we use community for it? Can we use belonging for it? Can we use access? Can we use human rights? And I think it's really important that we stay relevant and stay dynamic in that aspect. And so I believe strongly in DEI. Don't get me wrong. I think DEI has brought a lot of good possibilities for us. But I think to go further, we need to look at what are some other potential frameworks that we can use, and how can we implement these in our lives, in our workplaces, in our communities.
What does resilience mean to you?
Oh, that word. I It depends on how it's being used. I sometimes feel like resilience is used as a way of saying, oh, you've had a hard time, but you're just doing so well, and kind of talking about resilience, I feel like sometimes can be patronizing. But that being said, I think equity deserving communities are resilient. And that for me, on a more personal level, is my ability to scrape myself off, dust myself off, and put myself back in the ring. And that is something that we shouldn't have to do as equity deserving people, but it is something that we need to do just because of the society we live in. And so resilience for me is something that I live. It's something that I embody. As you know, I'm recovering from a broken wrist. I picked myself up with a broken wrist by myself, got the ER by myself, all of those things, and really said, okay, this is a setback. This is a major setback, but this isn't going to stop me. This might mean I have to take moments of rest. And I think rest as resilience is a powerful thing, and rest as resistance as well. I think that resilience is just a part of life for us as equity deserving people, as people who experience discrimination, and as people who are just living in the world. And so for me, it's not something I could describe with one definition, but is something that I feel like I embody.
One of the things I'm exploring this season is the relationship between resilience and survival, how they're similar, how they're different. And I'm wondering
Mm.
whether you have any ideas around that.
So I would say that the difference between resilience and survival is just something that happens, while as resilience is how you get there. Survival is something that can happen. You can survive something without having to put in the effort. because other people around you have supported you through it or have created space for you, have created community for you. And it's a lot of work being part of community and putting into community. So don't get me wrong there. But I think resilience is something that we push past what is holding us back, while a survival is more, we got through it. And so we can get through it without having to do the work, depending on what we're getting through. But sometimes you need that resilience to be able to survive, depending on what it is. And so that survival, I think, is important, but resilience is the thing that drives you there.
What are your practices of resilience?
Community, rest, connection, all of those things are practices of resilience for me. I would say with community, having those connections to other people brings me joy, brings me life, brings me happiness, all of the things I need to be resilient. Because if you're always just getting beaten down, if you never have joy, if you never have connection, it's really hard to keep going. But that connection, that joy, those spaces for queer joy in particular are so powerful. I go out dancing to trans events, for example, which I'm very lucky to live in a city that has trans-centric events, because that's not the case for everybody, right? And being in community is so powerful for me, brings me so much joy, brings me so much connection, and really gives me that power. Now, rest, though, is also one of those tools of resilience where I think we are conditioned to go, go, go. And there's so much in the world that is telling us that we just have to go, go, whether that's caregiving responsibilities or work responsibilities or religious responsibilities, whatever those might be. But you can't do those things without creating space for rest. And I think, as an autistic person, that looks a bit different for me. Like I need, sometimes rest for me needs to be completely like no sensory space type of thing. Sometimes that means creating these other types of spaces, but that might look different for another person. For another person, their rest might be jamming to really, really loud music. And I've been there. I've been that person too. But for the most part, I'm not necessarily that person. And so, creating that space for rest is powerful. And there's a really great book called Rest is Resistance. And it talks about how we cannot survive as people who experience discrimination without rest. And that giving space for rest makes us more resilient, gives us power, and says that we own our own power as well.
How can people reach you if they want to contact you?
So the best place to contact me is through LinkedIn at Jade Pichette, JadePichette. I'm also on Blue Sky if you want my hot takes, jadepichette.bluesky.social, or contact me via email. You can contact me at Pride at Work by going to jade.pichette@prideatwork.ca or just through our website.
Jade Pichette, trans advocate, DEI professional, director of programs at Pride at Work Canada, and all around amazing person. Thank you for coming on my show and for sharing your insights, your wisdom, and your expertise on this very important topic of inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabio. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for listening to The Stumbling Spirit, Contemplations on the Path of Resilience. This is Fabio da Silva Fernandez. Join me again next week for another episode of transformative stories and beneficial practices to guide you on your wellness journey. If you wish, you can follow and DM me on Instagram at The Stumbling Spirit. Until next time, take a deep breath and another step forward on your path of resilience.